Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Jarrell Mason. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Album Cover, where we get inside the entertainment industry with those in the know and give them their flowers while they're here to be celebrated. With me right now, I have a man that hails from Cincinnati, Ohio. You've heard him on various radio shows with his syndicated show Timeless Tracks, radio hits, giving us nuggets of R&B history. Author has the book right here. You can see it. Get it wherever books are sold. It's a great read. We're gonna dive into R&B history. This man had me sold at being mentored by one of my many influences of getting into this game, Mr. Casey Kasem. And don't let the smooth voice fool you, just like King Cobra. If you know, you know. His voice melts like butter. We're gonna get into all that and then some with America's premier R&B historian, Mr. Tyrone DuBose. Mr. DuBose, thank you for coming on Beyond the Album Cover, sir, and it's a pleasure.
The absolute pleasure is mine, my friend. Thank you so much for thinking of me and allowing me to be in your space. It means a lot.
Yes, sir. And also, I also mentioned as well, you've seen him on Unsung, contributing in various episodes, his knowledge of R&B. So let's go ahead and jump right on in. Like I stated at the top of the intro, from Cincinnati, Ohio, which is the home of Sid Nathan, King Records, and then you mentioned in your book about James Brown. So let's talk about where did your love of music start growing up in Cincinnati?
When I first began, first of all, once again, thank you so very much for allowing me to be in your space. It means a lot to me to be here today. I first began by, of course, as a kid in the 60s, of course, we always listen to our parents' records all the time. And but as time went on, I got to listening. There was a show that came on called American Top 40 with Casey Kasem and American Top 40, and it was a big influence on me. And I think part of it was not just the countdown aspect, but its rich history. But more importantly, Casey Kasem being able to speak and talk about things. He told a story when he talked about his artist and when he talked about the artist in the countdown. And I said I wanted to be like him.
hmm Yeah, and just know people don't go into an up tempo after you talk about a dead dog dying in your love letter long distance dedication. If you know, you know. Now, were there any local DJs in the Cincinnati area on the radio that you listened to and said, "Man, I want to be like that"? In addition to Casey Kasem as well.
As a matter of fact, there was one of them was Jim Scott. He was a bit folksy, and actually, I got a chance to meet him before he passed away about a year or so ago. And he was my idol in radio. And one of the things I liked about him was the fact that he was always kind to people, and the way in which he spoke to you when he talked to people, when he talked to people on the air, it was like you were talking to a friend. And then when I got a chance to meet him, as I'm around him, I noticed that he would do the little things that made people feel like they were very important. He'd always ask them their name. What's your name? What do you do? In other words, he was engaging. And I like that about him. Another one was another called Lincoln Ware, and he's still on the air in Cincinnati as well. In the same vein, they both were pretty much the same. Although one did pop for the most part, and the other one did R&B.
And kind of sort of similar to myself, I grew up in North Carolina, grew up listening to K97.5, which is the R&B station in the Raleigh Durham market. Some of the influences are Cy Young, Wink Moody, various others. And then, of course, Casey Kasem, Don Cornelius. Grew up watching America's Top 10 right after Soul Train at 12 o'clock. So you know what time it is. And getting into the business. Was it where you cut your teeth in the local stations before hooking up with Casey Kasem, or was it where you just made a direct line to getting mentored with Casey Kasem?
It was a little of both to some degree. One of them was as I created the show Timeless Tracks. I would from Los Angeles here where I'm at. I would literally drive 145 miles to a little town called Barstow, California, which was halfway to Vegas. I had a full time job, but I had a full time dream as well. And I would go to my regular job every other weekend, and then I'd go to Barstow, and I'd be on the air from midnight to 6. And it helped me to not only overcome the fear of being on the air and being heard, but it gave me an opportunity to develop a similar style to some degree, somewhat like Casey Kasem. And then afterwards, I created the show Timeless Tracks, but I did it based on R&B. I remember Mr. Kasem telling me all the time that R&B to some degree was fading, and he thought it would be a good idea for me to start looking at an opportunity of joining the history of R&B, and that was big for me.
And with Casey Kasem give you the kudos and the battery to jumpstart Timeless Tracks, what was that like having his co-sign and being able to at your niche in R&B?
It was really big for me because not only was it just Casey Kasem, it was the person that was my idol. I got a chance to meet him, and that was the part that, a guy from Cincinnati, Ohio, who moves to Los Angeles, and somehow or another you get an opportunity to meet your idol. It was everything to me. And at some point, I felt like there was a part of me that was lost. I had to try to figure out who I was, how to get there, what to do, how to do. I was struggling a little bit, to be perfectly honest. I was just trying to figure out what was I trying to become? What was going to make me different? That was the thing that I had to figure out.
Yeah, because I think when you first get into the business, you kind of look at the influences and try to pattern yourselves after them. But comes the part where you add your own flavor, you add your own spin. Because like me, I try to pattern myself after Donnie Simpson and Don Cornelius, where you want to be personable, but also know your stuff because you want to be respectful of the artists or the guests that you have coming on, and know that you're not somebody who's just stepped into the studio, got a good look, got a good face. Let's put you on the air. Let's put you behind the mic, but you want to make sure that you're well versed and you know your stuff.
Yes, no, I totally agree. And I have learned in my journey that not to be better. Better comes with a sense of expectations. You had to be able to begin to figure out the process of what made you different. Different always gets you what you want. A lot of times, better comes with expectations, and then there's a sense of comparison. So, what I had to learn was what was going to make me different than everybody else.
Right. And American Top 40, for those of you that don't know, or too young to remember or don't remember it, Casey Kasem, the host, the creator of American Top 40, countdown the 40 most popular songs in America, the hits from coast to coast. It was appointment radio. Some of you all probably stood by the radio to write down every single song in the chart position, what went up with a bullet, what went down with a thud. And then, if you were lucky, if you worked at the radio station, you either had to be a board op to run the full show, or if you could afford it, you had a cart reel to reel, and the production manager would record the show onto the reel, and you would hope and pray that it held up and that the engineer didn't have to come in and make any fixes.
Yeah, the interesting thing was in Cincinnati, it was American Top 40, but he would do, and on the radio station WSAI in Cincinnati, what they would do is that they would play 20 on Saturday, the first 20 on Saturday, and then the next 20 on Sunday. And then it kept you engaged and wanting to know what the number one song in America was. And that was really important to me because it was not just knowing the number one song, it was knowing the history of each artist. And many of those artists that I heard at that moment during Casey Kasem's time on the air are some of the artists in which I deal with today, when I go on R&B tours.
Wow, that's the first time I ever heard of the station splitting AT40 like that. Because most stations, they would do a running, let's say, on a Saturday, and then they'll do a replay on a Sunday. But to have it split like that, listener engagement, and will keep them tuned in right where it is.
Once again, that's exactly one of the most important things with all of the stuff that we do. You have to figure out what's going to make it different for you. And I think that was actually a smart move of WSAI to do that as well. And it was engaging to me because I never wanted to miss any of American Top 40. But I think it was just the fact, that it was his voice and the way in which he spoke to people, not just his long distance dedications, but his stories about who he spoke about and the why behind it. It was almost the same as being on Unsung. It helped me a great deal.
Definitely giving you the backstories of the songs and little tidbits that you may not know about. Now, back to your childhood in Cincinnati. What was the first record that you remember going to, let's say, a chain or a mom and pop, and buying and saying, "Man, I want to build up my record collection"?
Believe it or not, it was of all people, although, my mother, we had some music. We would listen to some of the early 60s and, of course, the 70s. I was in the disco era. But some of the records that really caught my attention, believe it or not, was Elton John. Now, Elton John was big in the 1970s. He was extremely unique. And what was great about Elton John was that he was doing all of this stuff in the middle of disco, and Barry Manilow as well. It was something to some degree in the beginning, something other than R&B music. But of course, I came in during the disco era as well. So it was the KC and the Sunshine Band, the Johnny Taylors, the Earth, Wind and Fire, the Marvin Gaye. Some of these things we already had at the house, but I always liked, I had a big affinity for Elton John.
And then let's go back a decade earlier to the 60s when we look at Motown and how Motown was really the start of where you really start to see R&B really cross over onto the charts. And we go down the list of all the roster of stars that came out of Detroit, and how Berry Gordy pretty much took the assembly line approach that he learned working at Ford, applied that to the music industry because you knew everything was going to be a hit because it was tested, approved, and it was gonna be refined before it hit the stores or hit the stage wherever you saw them on TV or on tour.
What was unique about Motown was the fact that they've learned and figured out that they were not going to be successful unless you crossed over. And meaning crossover means that you, as if you just stayed on the R&B charts, it didn't mean that you weren't successful, but the goal was being able to cross over where white artists were willing to listen to your songs as well, which is what made Diana Ross and the Supremes and some of the other Motown places so successful. And here's just a small fact. Three times the Beatles reached number one, and then three times the Diana Ross and the Supremes knocked them out of the number one position.
Wow, that's amazing. Just to give you a little backstory about Motown, at least for me, my wife and I a couple years ago, we went to Salt Lake City to see Motown the musical. Very great musical, very great. And then we're walking out, leaving to go to our vehicles. We see this elderly black gentleman wandering around, and some people coming up to him, and couldn't really make out who he was until I kind of got a good glimpse out of my peripheral, and it was Lamont Dozier.
Yes, Lamont Dozier was one of the premier, songwriters and producers of, and a part of Holland Dozier Holland. But the best part about Motown is that, as you mentioned, they were like a machine, and some of the biggest artists in the history of R&B came from Motown. Respectfully, the number one artist or the number one R&B group in history came from Motown, and that was the Temptations.
Yeah, speaking of the Temptations, if you have not seen Ain't You Proud of Bag, go see it. Saw it a couple of weeks ago off Broadway here in Albuquerque at Pope Joy. Definitely a great see. You definitely don't want to miss it. And on the opposite end of Motown, while they were focusing on crossing over to the pop side, you had Stax out of Memphis, which was pure, unadulterated, raw R&B that ended up crossing over on its own. And then the big bang for them came when Otis Redding performed at the Monterey Pop Festival.
Not only was Stax one of the big raw type energies of R&B, the truth of the matter is they had to find their niche in one region of the country to branch out, and that was the South. When you're able to move from the South, and another part of the reason why that worked out so well for them is because James Brown owned a majority of the R&B, the R&B radio stations in the South, and it got a chance to get lots and lots of airplay. Here's something unique that many people don't know. The number one artist in the 1960s was James Brown. The number one artist in the 1970s was James Brown. And the reason for that, although James Brown never crossed over to touch the pop charts, the top 10 of the pop charts, for 17 years after he made the song I'm Black and I'm Proud.
Hmm. And let's talk about Sid Nathan King Records with them being based out of Cincinnati and James Brown being signed to King.
James Brown was unique in his own right because what he would do is take a song that lasted maybe 2 minutes and 30 seconds or so and provide it in being a hit. He had to figure out his niche, and he had to, believe it or not, a lot of what I'd said earlier is the same with James Brown. He had to be different, not better, particularly in a place where the crossover appeal was very important. And that's what made James Brown unique. He was able to figure out the soulful aspect of it along with the dancing aspect and became a one-man show.
Yeah, he was definitely a guy you definitely don't want to be number two after a Bill because he was going to tear it down. See the Tammy show where he torched the stage and the Rolling Stones had to follow that.
Yes, I mean, nobody wanted to go after James Brown. But here's something unique that many people didn't know. Papa's got a brand new bag. It's a man's world. Some of these early records of James Brown crossed over and gave him the pop appeal that very few artists in the 1960s were doing. There was what was called a revolution of R&B music. Remember, at one point, the R&B charts didn't exist for a few years. They called it race music for quite some time. But then when it came back with a vengeance, James Brown was there. In 1968, after Martin Luther King passed away, he wrote the song I'm Black and I'm Proud. And he was warned not to release that song, but he released it. And the song indeed did reach the top 10 of the pop charts, but he never touched the top of the top 10s again of the pop charts for over 17 years until Sylvester Stallone begged him to come out of retirement when he made the song Living in America, and he got his only Grammy.
Wow. And then also too, right around that same time frame when Dr. King was assassinated, he performed in Boston at the Boston Garden. And to make sure that the streets were safe, people weren't out rioting, they broadcasted it live on TV so that everybody could stay at home and there could be peace in the streets.
It was really tough for people then at that of the assassination of Martin Luther King. He was the one voice in which African Americans had that had no sense of fear, and he was that way based upon his being able to show a nonviolent attitude in a country where we were at some point reviled in some areas. But the fact that he was able to calm a nation speaks volumes, not about just his music, but about his character and his legacy.
Right. And then staying in the Midwest, we're going to go into five young men out of Gary, Indiana, who exploded onto the charts. And then we all know what happened after that to Michael Jackson, the baby of the bunch. What was your take when you first heard the Jackson Five when they came across the scene? They were really the first crossover kid act to where they really set the standard for all of the boy groups that would follow after them, Hensley, New Edition.
Well, here's what's unique about the Jackson Five. Of the Jackson Five, what was extremely unique about them is that their first four songs crossed over to reach number one on the pop charts, and they would have reached number one again with the song "Mama's Pearl," but it stopped at number two because "One Bad Apple" reached the charts and hopped over them. The other part of that is 28 songs of the Jackson Five reached the top 10 of 20, I'm sorry, 28 songs of the Jackson Five actually reached the chart. Of 28 songs, 25 of those reached the top 10. And the Jackson Five was the number one act R&B group in the 1970s.
Right, and I'm sure you probably know, or maybe you don't, but One Bad Apple was originally supposed to have been recorded by the Jackson Five, but they turned it down, and that's how the Osmonds got it.
Exactly. Not only that, of course, there are other records that were turned down as well by many different people. For example, Kiss and Say Goodbye actually was for Glenn Campbell. He turned it down. The Manhattans took the song and reached number one with it, becoming the second platinum single in the history of R&B in
That,
music.
yeah, man, that I did not know. And then during COVID, I went back and listened to the Jackson Five's discography. While the Motown stuff was really good, very polished, very clean, I felt they really hit their stride once they left Motown, went over to CBS, got with Gamble and Huff, because that was where I think you start to see the seeds being planted for Michael to say, okay, I'm more than just being in this group. I'm gonna be my own artistic man. And then we saw what later came after that with Off the Wall, and of course, the blockbuster monster album known as Thriller.
Well, the hardest part of Michael Jackson was being able to constantly reinvent himself again. Very few people can consistently reinvent themselves, and Michael Jackson found a way to do that. But at some point, there became a sense of fatigue, not because it was Michael Jackson, but believe it or not, it was because music was changing as well. And after owning the R&B charts for over a decade, they had to find something different to do, and that's where when you began to see the beginning of rap. I'm going to stop you right there real quick. I got to cuss. Hold on, stay right there. Hey, Google, cancel timer. My apologies. Sorry
All
about
right.
that.
Yeah, so when Off the Wall came out, a lot of people were questioning, can Quincy Jones do a pop album? Because Quincy Jones, before linking up with Michael Jackson, touched various genres spanning decades, and they didn't think that he could do an album like that and working with a young artist like Michael Jackson. And he got to see up close and personal what he could really do when they were doing The Wiz.
Here's one of the hardest things that people don't understand. In the middle of the disco era, now we're moving into the 80s. And what was really catching hold in the early 80s wasn't R&B music, it was punk music. That was what was taking over. And remember, R&B music was just finally getting itself in a groove of being revolutionized to some degree. So here's a crossover between disco and pop music of Michael Jackson being able to somehow find his way. And that was unique in itself because there were very few R&B acts in the early 80s that were able to cross over to the pop charts. In fact, if you think about some of the R&B acts then in the early 80s, there were not a lot of them. There were not a lot.
Definitely not a lot. And how coming off of disco, you had this era called the boogie era, which was very much an offshoot of disco, had early hints of electro, synth, off the wall being leading that charge. Then you had the works of D Train, then Kashif, and then everything to come out of that. And how in 1981, there was this little channel that came on that revolutionized the music industry, revolutionized how artists marketed themselves, MTV. But in the beginnings, MTV didn't really play a lot of this. It
Well, the
wasn't
reason,
it. Go
well,
ahead.
I'm sorry. The reason why they didn't play a lot of that is because they didn't think that we, as Black people, had a sense of a revolution in us to be able to flood and fill the markets. And you're absolutely right. Part of the reason for that is that they didn't believe that R&B music was as strong as it was. Remember, even on the pop charts, and just to give you an example of that, like the reason why we've done so well, although in the 60s it was the Temptations and a lot of the Motown sound, while we did indeed do well with some of the R&B music from on the pop that crossed over in the early 80s, music was trying to find a foothold of itself as well, and it was hard for us and in R&B music to find a foothold to ourselves and being able to cross over. But the demand came as time went on, and once it the R&B music got through, it was a great breakthrough for R&B artists and a great breakthrough for music.
Yeah, because Rick James had sound the alarm with MTV not really playing a lot of black videos. And then, of course, there's an infamous interview with David Bowie, grilling Mark Goodman about why MTV is not playing black videos, even though BET was out a year prior to MTV. The labels with R&B budgets weren't really thinking, okay, let's go ahead and let's set some money aside for this new medium and let's make it available. But of course, as we all know, music industry, the pop dollars are going to be a lot bigger than the R&B dollars.
Keep in mind that R&B music really was just trying to find a place of its own as well, particularly in the late 1970s and early 80s. For a lot of people, R&B music was just a fad. We were still trying to find out where we belonged as well. So being able to get into places like this is going to require you to find a way of reinventing yourself. And there were very few people who spoke out to say that there was a problem with the fact that R&B music didn't exist in other people's homes. And remember, with MTV, that also required that you had cable television in. And cable television was new. And not a whole lot of Black people at that moment had enough juice, for lack of a better word, of being able to believe that R&B music had a chance to cross over into the homes of whites.
Right, and then also too, one of the shows that kind of helped R&B get into the mainstream was the hippest trip in America that originally started as a regional show out of Chicago. WCIU Don Cornelius, who was a part-time radio announcer for WVON, Voice of the Negro, decided to say, "Hey, let me take these local Chicago dances that's going around at these schools, put it on TV." It became a local hit, but then a year or so later decided to move west to LA, but since most of the labels are headquartered there and it's going to be a lot easier to book acts. So let's talk about the importance of Soul Train and how Soul Train helped usher R&B in to more mainstream homes after initially only airing in 7 cities in its debut in 1971.
So for the last few years, I get an opportunity to go on the Soul Train cruise, being able to see the rich history of not just R&B music, but the rich history and the history of Don Cornelius, who had an idea that we thought could only be just for us as Black people. But the truth of the matter is, R&B music, particularly with Soul Train, was all we had. In the 60s, we would watch Ed Sullivan, hoping to perhaps get a glimpse of R&B music, your Temptations, the Jackson 5, the Supremes. Black people didn't have an opportunity to see us on television every single week. So here comes Soul Train that was expressly for us, not just in its culture, not just in its music, but the way in which we dressed, its commercials, its culture. It gave us an opportunity to see us in a whole different light. But not just Black people, it gave white people an opportunity to see us in a different light as well.
Right, and then you mentioned Elton John. Elton John, along with David Bowie and Gino Vanelli, first white artists to perform on Soul Train and many others over the decades of that show. And then staying in the funk corridor in Ohio, what is it about Dayton that made it the funk capital of the world with all the acts coming out of there? Heat Wave, Lakeside, the Ohio Players, Zap, Roger Troutman. What was it about Dayton that made it the epicenter of all of those great bands coming out of there?
Well, let me begin by saying Heat Wave, believe it or not, although the two brothers, the Wilder brothers, came from Dayton, they were actually an international group with places from Sweden, Germany, and other places that put this group together that made them extremely unique. And in fact, right in the middle of disco was once again where so many of these groups began to take hold, including the Roger Troutman, who was unique in itself in being able to have the voice talking box, and probably one of the first in music history of being able to take one song that went to number one 3 different times by 3 different artists. I heard it through the grapevine, went to number one with Gladys Knight and the Pips. Motown decided that they wanted Marvin Gaye to do it, and it went to number one for 7 consecutive weeks on the pop charts, and at one time was the longest number one R&B, on actually the number one song in history. And then as time went on, the Voice Box with Zap somehow or another reaches number one. So here's one song that reached number one 3 different times. But there were many other things as well. The Ohio Players and so many other funk groups came out of Dayton, Ohio. It was one of the it places to be.
Then also at that time too, everybody was working factory jobs, had extra disposable income. Kids were able to get instruments, and this is back when music programs were very heavy in the schools. So you had all these bands being formed in either a garage, somebody's basement, cutting their teeth in the talent show circuit, and then everything came out of that from that great city known as Dayton.
One of the most unique things is that no matter whether you're in Dayton or Detroit, all of us in those ages had one thing in common: a dream. We wanted to be something in some kind of way. We were trying to figure out who we were, how to get there, what to do. So we start small and then we work our way up, hoping somehow or another someone sees us. Whether we're doing what we did, me being an R&B historian, or what you do, somehow or another, our goal is to try to find our way. And for people who had dreams, the way we did it was simplicity. We just had a dream. We went to the 9 to 5 paid the bills. The 6 to 10 built the empires.
Yeah, man, because you definitely got to pay your dues and really earn your keep. So let's talk about Stevie Wonder and how Stevie was able to make that transition from child star, adult star, legend, and how, fingertips. And then he put out his masterpiece run in the 70s, and how he pretty much set the standard for I'm going to put out what I want to put out, be artistically creative, not follow a formula. Because I believe when he was working on Songs in the Key of Life, it was such a lengthy project. He had a t-shirt put out that says it's almost finished or something to that degree, because he was really taking his time and was really marinating. And that album really, I think, set the stage to let people know that, okay, Stevie Wonder, he's one of those ones.
Well, let's start first with Fingertips, which, by the way, was the number one song on the pop charts. But what was unique about that, he was the first one, the youngest person to reach number one. In the 1970s, however, Stevie Wonder cut his teeth with all of the stuff in which he did, not only as a singer, but as a producer and he had Minnie Riperton, Denise Williams, and so many others that were a part of his legacy in the 1970s. But here's what's unique in the 1970s. Stevie Wonder, with all of the rich history of R&B, didn't even crack the top 10 of some of the greatest acts. Although he had several number one songs, was huge on not just the R&B chart, but the pop chart. But the R&B charts as well was so rich with so many people. Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, and Barry White didn't crack the top 10 of the R&B at that moment. However, in the 1980s, Stevie Wonder was so big, he was 47 points away from being the number 2 act in the decade of the 1980s. Number 3 was Michael Jackson. I'm sorry, number 3 was Stevie Wonder. 47 points above him was Stevie Wonder. That's how big R&B music was, and the legacy of Stevie Wonder.
Right, and you mentioned Denise Williams cut her teeth singing backgrounds for Stevie Wonder in Wonderland, and also I believe coming up under Stevie Wonder was Ray Parker Jr., Michael Sambello, and I think Greg Gaines also came up under Stevie Wonder as well.
Here's a unique story. One day, Stevie Wonder's called Ray Parker and asked Ray Parker would he be interested in working with him, and Ray Parker said he hung up on him, and then he said he thought it was a joke. And then Stevie called him again, and Ray Parker said, "This ain't Stevie Wonder," and hung up. Somebody had to convince him that it was actually Stevie Wonder who was calling him. But that's what's so unique about R&B music. Somehow or another, you had to find your way in a place where at one point your music wasn't even a part of music history. And somehow we forced our way in to become some of the best music in the history of the world.
All right, and watch this time right here. You mentioned Fingertips earlier. Number one crossover smash for Stevie Wonder. Fingertips was sampled by Shaka Khan in I Feel For You, which became a hit for her back in 1984, which was originally done by a young man out of Minneapolis, Minnesota by the name of Prince Rogers Nelson. So let's talk about Prince and the whole Minneapolis sound.
Prince was not only just a great human being, he was a great musician. And by the way, at the Super Bowl, he had over 133 million people watching him in the rain, being able to do the Super Bowl halftime show. Prince was so good, in fact, he was the number 1 artist in the decade of the 1980s. Not Michael Jackson, while many people would believe he was. It was actually Prince by a long shot. This man had the opportunity to recognize he wasn't trying to be relevant. He was constantly reinventing his sound, and he was cutting his teeth in the middle of the 80s, particularly in the decade of the 80s where R&B male artists dominated music at that point.
Right, and then seeing how when he performed his showcase for Warner Brothers and Mo Osteen and a lot of the Suits, they originally wanted Maurice Wright from Earth, Wind and Fire to EP his album, but Prince was like, no, I'm all contained. I'm gonna write, I'm gonna produce, I'm gonna play. And to think for an artist who's unknown at that time to say no, and I'm gonna do it all myself, that was a bold move, and it paid big dividends for him and Warner Brothers.
Not only what did it pay big dividends for him, and he took much of a risk. The truth of the matter is, but he showed actually that he believed in himself more than he believed that anybody else was going to be able to take him to another level. This is what people do. That's how winning is done, although we don't know that at the time. But he was smart enough to, at that point, recognize he could do it. Now, there were other people who believed that Prince took away from Rick James, which to some degree, while he may have taken a bit part of Rick James, there's no comparison about who was better between the two.
Yeah, I had Dr. Fink on the podcast not too long ago, and he shared for me the story when they were touring with Rick James and how Rick was like unplugging mics and amps and like, uh-oh, this boy's coming.
Yeah, I mean, the truth of the matter is, one of the things that I believe that caused Rick James a bit of issues to some degree is that he was constantly trying to be relevant instead of reinventing. It was difficult for him, particularly in the 80s. Male artists cracking the top 10 in any way, shape, or form was rough because there was Michael Jackson, Prince, Stevie Wonder, and Luther Vandross, the top 4 male artists of the decade. So if you were able to crack the top 10 in any kind of way, shape, or form, that was huge. And there were very few that did, by the way. It was only until 1990 when he did Lucy's Rap that Rick James reached the top 10 and reached number 1 again.
Right, and Roxanne Shante was the female rapper that's on Lucy's Rap. And let's talk about one of the most underrated dynasties of the 80s that I don't think get enough due, doesn't get talked about enough, Solar.
Solar Records, meaning Sound of Los Angeles Records, was really, really huge. Not only did they have, of course, the Whispers, and they also had the Deal as well and Shalimar, but they had a wide array of players and R&B groups that consistently kept reaching the top 10 of the R&B charts. But although they were really great at that particular time, they had a tough time reaching the pop charts. And like many people did, primarily because it was dominated by R&B artists such as Michael Jackson and some of the other ilk. But ultimately, the R&B from Solar Records made history of being able to have 4 of the top 50 artists in the decade of the 1950s.
Yeah, and originally Solar was Soul Train Records partnership between Don Cornelius and Dick Griffey. They put out the Soul Train gang, and then once Don Cornelius decided to step away from the label to focus full time on the show, Dick Griffey helmed it and rebranded it as Solar. And then we had all the artists came out of Solar, such as Shalimar, Dynasty, the work that Atlantic Star, Midnight Star did out of Solar, and also LA and Babyface cut their teeth doing some stuff for Solar as well. And with Ellie Reed being from Cincinnati, Babyface being from Indianapolis, Indiana. And when you look at the early album covers of the deal, that shows you just a strong influence Prince and everything the Minneapolis sound had on everybody, because whether it was Ready for the World out of Flint, Dream Boy out of Oak Park, Michigan, the deal, pretty much everybody was following the pattern that Prince laid. Even if you were listening to The Time, Apollonia 6, Vanity 6, The Family, even though they were all separate acts, the one connector to all of them was Prince.
One of the other things that you mentioned that is so important is that people will follow what's working. If they see a direction where you're seeing something that's working that you think may perhaps work for you, then we go that direction. So there was nothing unreasonable or unusual for them at that point of being able to try to find something that would work. Remember, you're trying to crack one of the biggest assemblies. It was almost like a revolution once again. It was the reinvention of R&B after the revolution of R&B in the 1970s. And you're trying to cut your teeth to somehow or another find a sense. In this case, particularly after some of the biggest top 10 artists in history are reaching the top 10 of the R&B charts, now you're trying to find a way to be relevant, which is difficult to do at a time like this. And let's not forget, by the way, in the middle of all that was not only just Michael Jackson, it was Janet Jackson.
Mm-hmm. So let's back up into the 70s real quick. Let's talk about Phil International, Gamble and Huff, and how they created the iconic theme for Soul Train, which was TSOP, Sounds of Philadelphia. But in a documentary that aired on Soul Train years ago, Don Cornelius had stated that he was so protective of the brand that he didn't allow the name of the show to be used for the theme, and that's why it was named TSOP. But I think he probably regretted not naming it Soul Train, and how, Gamble and Huff, their run with Philly International definitely should be held in the same regards as Motown and as other stacks.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And not only were they great, I mean, you have to keep in mind there's so many groups that came out of there. The OJs and the Stylistics as well, which by the way had 9 consecutive top 10 singles on the R&B charts, reaching the top 10 with You Make Me Feel Brand New and some of the other songs in which they had that were huge at that point. So yeah, Gamble and Huff and all of the Philadelphia sound was extremely important. Remember, music didn't just come out of Motown. They had different regions: Los Angeles, Detroit, Philadelphia, even in Miami, where TK Records came out with KC and the Sunshine Band and Gwen and George McCrae. There were so many different regions of where music came from, where it was enough for everybody.
Yeah, everybody ate, and also you had, I believe it was Deep City Records out of Miami that kind of laid the groundwork, and it was also one of the first times that a lot of people heard Betty Wright and how she came onto the national scene with Clean Up Woman and all of her later hits. And then let's go into BT once again and a little show called Video Soul. What was your take when you first saw Video Soul, heard the smooth voice of Donnie Simpson, and knowing that this was a program that was going to be integral in getting R&B music out there and making BT a player in the music industry?
Donnie Simpson was groundbreaking because what happened is that for the first time, R&B music had a place to go. We didn't have to beg anymore for your MTV. We had a place to go. In the mid 80s, we would watch television come home, run home, watch television to see any videos. But then the prominent videos were these other places at this point. But what made it better for us was the fact that Video Soul was just for R&B music. And then it gave us an opportunity to show not just your bigger stars, but the smaller stars as well, such as Donna Allen with Sirius and some of these other ones and the Force MDs and some of these other groups that really didn't get a lot of airplay, but they got a lot of video play, which by the way was also the part that reinvented Lionel Richie from some degree from the Commodores reaching up, becoming his own man as far as being a solo artist is concerned.
Right. And then I made this point after I saw the Luther Vandross documentary, Never Too Much, and how me being a child of the 90s, being a little kid in the 80s, and just hearing how R&B radio or black radio at the time when it was called, how it was where you heard Luther, Anita, Sade, Prince, Michael Jackson, Whitney, and then later on you hear the emergence of all the acts from the New Jack Swing era, Keith Sweat, Bobby Brown, Guy, I'll Be Sure, New Edition, Troop, and how it kind of caused a conundrum for R&B radio program directors where we got this youth movement coming in R&B, but we're not of that ilk because we're more of the 9 to 5. We're gonna go drink some Bartle and James, go to an after hours dinner spot. And how do we mesh those two things plus the emergence of rap? Because at this time, rap was only relegated to being played on weekends and mix shows, and people still looked at it as not a legitimate musical genre to be dealt with.
One of the things that helped, let me begin first with the first part you talked about as far as the Luthers and the Freddies and all of R&B music in its smooth stages of the 1980s. But what they began to do as music began to progress, they started sectioning off different places of being able to hear certain music. For in other words, you wanted the 80s sound, you'd hear that in a certain time. 90s sound, you'd hear it at a certain time. The beginning of rap, you heard it at a certain time. You know, when rap began, it was something that was kind of fun of just simply being able to talk. And then it moved in a different direction. It moved when people began to get the sales. When the sales started changing, so did the record labels. So did the radio stations. They had to begin to recognize they had to change who they were and what they were doing, not just for the sake of the music itself, but for the sake and the sanity and the survival of their own radio stations.
Yeah, and then also sprinkled in there too, you had crossover acts because George Michael, Wham got play on R&B radio, and then of course when Faith exploded, he became the first white artist to go #1 on Billboard's R&B charts. He won the AMA for Best R&B Album and R&B Artist, and at the time he caught a lot of flack for that because once again with the history of the music industry and everything goes, we go to Elvis and everybody after that. Whereas like this is for us, you're coming into our space, and George Michael couldn't understand why he was receiving so much backlash because him and all those acts from England, like Boy George Culture Club, Duran Duran, Spandau Ballet, all of them would list U.S. R&B influences, and then that's what led him to name his second solo album, Listen Without Prejudice. But it was a great time in R&B, and then I would say '86, in my opinion, was the shift because you had, of course, Luther, Anita, Sade. Then you had the emergence of kind of the prototype for what was to come with New Jack Swing with Full Force and their production work, and then Janet Jackson's work on Control with Jim and Lewis, and then of course Teddy Riley kicked the door open when he came out with Make It Last Forever for Keith Sweat, and then Guy's debut album a year later in '88. So what was your take when New Jack Swing came in and you noticed R&B was adopting more of a hip hop sound and having a little bit more attitude and bite?
Well, let me begin first of all with something that you said earlier, and that was about George Michael. One of the things that I always believed was so unfair, particularly for some of these artists, was the fact that they believed that R&B just belonged to them. And to some degree, that's absolutely 100% true. But the fact of the matter is, R&B music influenced so many of the white artists. To most of them, they felt as though they were paying homage to R&B music in that regard, and they couldn't be at #1 on the R&B chart unless black people were buying them. No different than R&B artists being number one on the pop charts because white people were buying them. So I didn't think that it was a fair assessment for George Michael in that regard. Both both of them intertwined together, no matter how we look at it. When you mentioned Elvis Presley, the number one artist in the 1950s was Fats Domino by a long shot. But the second biggest artist on the R&B chart was Elvis Presley, meaning that he was bigger than any 50s acts, Hank Ballard and the Moonlighters, the Chiffons, so many of our R&B artists from the 1950s, but they were buying Elvis Presley in the 1950s, and it was because R&B music hadn't made its mark yet. But once R&B did make its mark in the 70s and the 80s, it wasn't that they were somewhat being swagger jacked by white artists. The truth of the matter is they were influenced by the music of the artist then. And look, I think George Michael's album, the about being prejudiced, I think that was fair. I don't think it was right. Somehow or another, black people were buying his music. I didn't see anything wrong with that.
Yeah, me neither, because I remember as a kid seeing his stuff played regularly on Video Soul.
And it played on black, and listen, it played on black stations as well. Look, we didn't listen to that music. Not fair for him. I didn't think that was right to do that to him. But not just him. There are so many others that did the same exact thing. I mean, why, music is a universal language. While I do appreciate the fact that when R&B music had to find the sections of its own because black people didn't have it, I don't think it was unreasonable to believe that it was wrong to have white artists cross over to the R&B charts. In fact, the number one act, for example, in the 1970s was called Wild Cherry, would play that funky music. Guess what? That was the first artist to reach number one on the R&B chart in 55 years. And that was when Sugar Shack in 1955. So I didn't think it was unreasonable at that point. That meant that black people were buying white music.
Yeah, and this was also at a time too where the marketing, if you're a white artist doing R&B music, they wouldn't put your face on the album cover because they felt if they put your face on the cover, it would deter you getting play on R&B radio and buyers. So for Bobby Caldwell, Tina Marie, and other acts, you let the music speak for itself, and then you reveal the face. Almost sort of the same thing with New Kids on the Block. Not a lot of people know that New Kids on the Block was signed to the Black Music Division at Columbia Records. And then they had put out a video for Please Don't Go Girl, which only got airplay on BET. And then it was where a pop DJ out of Florida played Please Don't Go Girl on a whim. After seeing the video on BET, that was when the pop promotion started for New Kids, but they were an R&B group at the core that later exploded on the pop charts.
Look, in the 90s, that was the reinvention of not just music in itself, it was the reinvention of boy bands, and not just, the New Kids on the Block and LFO and NSYNC and some of these others. But the truth is that for the 90s, it was the reinvention of R&B groups, your Jodeci's and some of these other groups that were huge back in the day then. All of that stemmed from R&B music, and I mean the reinvention of R&B groups. And the fact is that since the 90s, there have been very few, if any, R&B groups, again, any new ones, because it's not the same anymore, because it required in the 90s, there were A&R and some of these other places that allowed, for music to be expanded. Now, all you need to do is just get 4 or 5 people together, and somehow or another they go on YouTube or try to go on social media to make themselves different or better, and that's how it works.
Right. And in the mid 80s, another run that I think doesn't get talked about enough, just like Solar, Hush. Everything that came out of Hush Productions, Paul Lawrence, Freddie Jackson, Melba Moore, Kashif, Lilo Thomas, and that run should be talked about more. Freddie Jackson had just as much as big of a run on the R&B charts just as Luther. I think the only difference was Luther just had the songs that crossed over to pop, while Freddie with You Are My Lady, Rock Me Tonight, I believe they went top 20 pop, but they were more of a mainstay on the R&B charts than they were on the pop charts.
Well, when you talk about Luther Vandross and Freddie Jackson, particularly in the 80s, many people would always debate which one was better. The number one person who had more number one singles on the R&B charts in the 1980s was Freddie Jackson. It wasn't Luther Vandross. Freddie Jackson was bigger on the R&B charts based on his number one songs. But the number one artist in the 1980s between the two was Luther Vandross. And that was based on his crossover to the pop charts when he reached over there 14 times to the pop charts, and Luther and Freddie Jackson reached over there only 7. But that doesn't mean, it doesn't take away from many of these artists. For example, while one of the most amazing bands and groups in the history of R&B, believe it or not, was Frankie Beverly and Maze, but he never crossed over to reach the top of any of the top 20 of the pop charts at all. But he was a group that was very, very important to the mainstay of R&B culture.
Hmm. Now, what was your take when you first heard Janet Jackson's Control?
I knew that it was something that was unique. Remember, the two the two producers, that just slipped my mind just to that quick. Jam and Lewis had, believe it or not, had a number one single, "I'm Only Human," that for another group that was from England. Then moved on um, and then helped Janet Jackson as well as several other artists to become mainstream success. Look, it was smart for them to get Janet Jackson because they gave her something that no one else could give her, and that was a sense of reinvention after being on television and on Fame and Good Times as well. So I thought it was a smart move for her, and her run was nothing short of incredible. And by the way, for a long time, she was at one time the second biggest gold selling artist in history. While there was Aretha Franklin at number one, it was Janet Jackson at number two.
Yeah, you mentioned Human record by the Human League and how when Jam and Lewis hooked up with Janet, while the first two albums, the self-titled album and the Dream Street album, great records produced by Leon Silvers, written songs written by Renee and Angela. They were great records, but it didn't really have an audio identifier for Janet. And the smart thing that they did was gather out of California, gather to Minneapolis, and built a character profile for her to say anything that we talk about is going to be on record. So a lot of those records on Control were just based out of either conversations they had in the studio or situations that Jam and Lewis observed Janet being in, and it became a masterpiece album. And she was able to really ride that wave of Control. And then 3 years later came River Nation and everything else after that. And Control really said to everybody, "Look, I'm more than just being the baby sister of the Jacksons, being Michael's sister. I can stand on my own 2 feet too."
One of the things that you have to do in music is what they say is called thread the needle, meaning that you've got to find some sort of way to be different at some point. And Janet Jackson was able to do that, particularly in the 80s, with although there was a sense of R&B music being dominated by women. The truth is, men dominated the R&B charts by a long shot. It was huge. The top 10 of the acts of R&B music primarily wasn't R&B women. It was R&B men. Although many people want to believe that Anita Baker and and Tina Turner, they weren't even in the top 50 of the biggest acts, and there was only one R&B act that of a female artist that was there. So, and the other part of that is many people always think about some of these major R&B solo acts, including Janet Jackson, as being one of the top artists, female artists in the 1980s. The top female artist in the 1980s was none other than Aretha Franklin. She was the number one artist in the 1980s, but not by much, because just behind her was Stephanie Mills, with her over 300 weeks on the R&B chart, getting her just below Aretha Franklin.
Yeah, and you mentioned Stephanie Mills. She was the mainstay on R&B radio when I was a kid. Hearing a lot of her earlier stuff, before she hooked up with Reggie Lucas and Mtume, that it was great records. But once she got with those two, that was when the ball started rolling for her. And vocally, no slouch yourself, because you got to be a vocal powerhouse in order to do Broadway.
R&B had a lot of vocal powerhouses, and particularly Stephanie Mills. And one of the things that helped Stephanie Mills out a lot was what helped so many R&B artists out in the 1980s: video soul. It was huge because that was the only outlet where we knew that our videos were being played consistently. Now, some of the exceptions was Lionel Richie, only from the standpoint that his crossover power made him just as big. But generally speaking, R&B music relied a lot up on video soul, which was innovative to some degree because people were trying to find ways of being innovative with their videos to match with their music.
And then another female artist during that time frame who I felt should have had big success, but labels did not know what to do with her because vocally she could go any way she wanted, and that was the late great Phyllis Hyman.
Phyllis Hyman had it going, but a lot of the struggle with Phyllis Hyman wasn't just her music. It was just trying to figure out where she belonged in the type of music that was moving along then. Some of it became a niche market for your places such as Phyllis Hyman and some of these other people. Remember, old school R&B acts are still just as good right now as they've ever been. Recently, I was with the Al McKay Earth, Wind, and Fire experience on the Soul Train cruise, and I got to tell you, they were probably one of the best acts I've seen in years because they put in the production of being able to bring you back to a time when music was the most important part of all of our lives.
Right. And then one of the groups that we look at now as a legacy act, but back when they debuted in 1983, they were looked at as an offshoot of the Jackson Five. Five young men out of Boston, Massachusetts, and later one out of Washington, D.C., revolutionized the R&B and pop music industry, reset the standard for all boy groups. They took a little bit of the groups that came after them, the Temptations, Delphonics, Shy Blue Magic, the Whispers, and added a pinch of hip hop in there because in 1983, to hear a rap record on an R&B song was revolutionary. So can we just talk about New Edition and their legacy and how they changed the game, not only as a group, but as individual acts as well?
New Edition was probably one of the greatest acts in R&B music as a group, not just because of their appeal, because they were kind of this kid group, but because they were able to sing like grown men at that time in the 80s. And, they had another number one song, Mr. Telephone Man, written by Ray Parker. Believe it or not, that song actually was for someone else, and they took it, but then New Edition took the song and made it a top 10 record. What's amazing about New Edition wasn't the fact that they were just a group, a successful group. They were successful without each other by individuality between them, even including not just Bobby Brown, but Johnny Gill and BBD and all the others. Away from each other, they had a total of 15 number one songs between them. That in itself shows you not just R&B history, that shows Black history.
Right, and you mentioned Mr. Telephone Man being originally written and recorded for someone else. That someone else was Junior Tucker, and then of course New Edition re-recorded became the pop smash. And let's not forget, people, Bobby Brown, even though he put out King of Stage in 1986, Don't Be Cruel was the best-selling album of 1989, went diamond, number one album of that year, and Bobby Brown was a crossover superstar once Don't Be Cruel launched.
Yeah, not only was he a superstar then with all of that, the truth of the matter is he had a number one song with Girlfriend that had just been in itself when he was first moving on and trying to figure out his space and place in R&B history. But what was unique about that, once again, wasn't just his music, it was his dance moves as well that kept people captivated. People loved that. You had to find something different about yourself, and that was the most important thing.
Yeah, and then the one thing that they did so well was when they were in between that period where after they put out All for Love and then they did Under the Blue Moon, and while they were trying to figure out their next steps after Bobby getting voted out, it was where Michael Bivins decided to bring in Johnny Gill. And originally he was supposed to have been a solo artist on MCA, but once Johnny got convinced to go into New Edition, and once Gerald Busby, then of course Jamin Lewis all saw the vision of, okay, we're gonna put him in here with this already established brand, and we are finally gonna get the records that's gonna vocally tell people these aren't the same boys 5 years earlier that was singing Candy Girl. We're gonna have mature songs to fit the look and the sound, and with Johnny Gill's vocal tone and the grit and the gruff, I kind of think, this is my theory now, that Jamin Lewis working with Alexander O'Neal kind of set the template on how to integrate Johnny into New Edition.
Look, having a hit producer duo gives you a lot of flexibility, no matter who you're dealing with. Of course, not only just with the Human League, Janet Jackson, New Edition, there's and Alexander O'Neal, and several others as well. But the part that mattered the most was the fact that he got New Edition and reinvented them with the song "Can You Stand the Rain," which went to number one for 2 weeks on the R&B charts. It was huge at that time because at that point they had to reestablish themselves and say we're a great group with or without Bobby Brown, which was tough to do at that moment, but they figured it out. And then once again, like so many other great R&B groups, they found a way to come together again to make it right. Kudos to them.
Yeah, because I feel like New Edition finally they are getting what they should have gotten a long time ago after the miniseries, and seeing with them touring and younger generations are coming out to the shows and a whole new generation through that miniseries getting introduced to one of the greatest groups to ever touch a stage.
Yeah, and it was really important, bro, because what happens is that in the 80s, it wasn't just music, it was competition. Do you realize, I mean, not just with them, but there was Troop. There were so many R&B groups that were around that mattered so much on in the history of not just R&B music, but in the history of music. And that's what's brought us to where we are today.
Yeah, because I can remember being a little kid whenever the If It Isn't Love video comes on, pretending to be them doing the moves. Same thing with Troop and Spread My Wings. I always say Troop is my number two group. New Edition is one. Now with Troop, I'm not sure if you know this, but Turned Away was originally supposed to go to Troop. And I interviewed Chucky Booker, and Chucky Booker told me that he had played it for Sylvia Rhone with Head of Atlantic. And Sylvia Rhone told him it's going on your album. He told her, no, this is Troop. She was like, nope, this is yours. And when he told Troop this, they were like, man, we want a record similar. And that's how they got Spread My Wings. But I felt
Well,
Troop
yeah,
was
not
a
only
group that, should have had more of the crossover success like a New Edition, because dancing wise, nothing to play with. Vocally, nothing to play with. And then Steve Russell came into his own as a writer and as a producer once they did Attitude and then later the Deeper album.
what makes this unique in its entirety, keeping it in the same context, the problem wasn't that there weren't great groups. The problem is that there were many great groups. Here's a group, by the way, that took one of only three Jackson 5 songs, All I Do Is Think of You, that didn't reach the top 20. Out of 28 songs for them, they took it and took it to number one. Troop did. So that's what made them unique in that part. Or the bell, I'm sorry. Let me say that part again. The bell just rang. That means I got to get to the studio. So I can take a couple more questions if you're okay with that.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's definitely fine. So with Troop and All I Do, I grew up hearing All I Do Is Think of You by Troop, Sweet November by Troop, which was originally done by The Deal. And real quickly, your take on when New Jack Swing came into play, especially Key Sweat, Make It Last Forever, and Guy's debut album.
New Jack Swing came right on the edge of R&B music and in the beginning of rap. It's almost a in between R&B music and in between rap became New Jack Swing. And New Jack Swing was extremely important because what it did, people were kind of burning out with the Michael Jackson aspect of things. Not that it was a bad thing, but they were looking for something new. And New Jack Swing did just that because it combined R&B music with a little bit of hip hop to some degree, and then it combined them together and you were able to hear music and hip hop almost at the same time. Hip hop and R&B equal to some degree New Jack Swing.
Yeah, peanut butter and chocolate mixed in the middle tastes so good. Last thing, and I'm gonna get you out of here on this. Where do you see the current state of R&B and how streaming has changed the music industry, and where music doesn't really have that community feel where everybody's gathering together, listen to a record, and you don't really have the physical medium to touch? Although amongst younger people, cassette sales are coming back.
Well, here's part of the problem. In the old days when we were listening to music, it required A&R. It required people that were around you, molding you, making you something. Now, all you need to do is go viral to some degree without all of the other people around you, and you figure out a way. Remember, MC Hammer was selling his stuff out of the trunk of his car in the early 90s, and we thought that that was new. Now you don't even need to buy music anymore because you could just simply get it from off of YouTube or some of those natures where people were making their money then. R&B requires for you in the world that we used to live in to now feel the same way about music. It's going to require 4 or 5 people to think exactly the same and hope that somehow or another that they'll be willing to combine music together to become something. It's the reason why we don't have R&B music much anymore, because R&B isn't just music anymore. It's a part of culture. It was culture then, but what the purpose of me becoming an R&B historian was be us to begin to remember the importance of the history of R&B music.
R&B music is still alive, still out there. You just got to go dig for it. Current projects, real quick.
I am still on Sirius XM. I'm doing the R&B Uncovered series for them, where I do a lot of the stuff for Sirius XM as well, the history of some of the R&B artists and their birthdays on there. I'm doing something on the ID network called Death by Fame, and that's based upon true stories of R&B artists as well. And my show called, based on my #1 book from Amazon, The 4 Seasons of R&B. It is going to be on television soon. I've got a 3-part series that's coming on. So I'm really excited about that. And I am blessed beyond belief for all of the things that have happened for me. And I cannot thank everybody enough for the kindness in which I've been shown in just finding my way to be a not just a better historian, but a better human being.
All right. Shout outs you want to give and plug your socials.
A shout out I want to give, first of all, is to you, my friend, for reaching out to me, for allowing me to come on your wonderful platform and being here. It means an awful lot that you thought enough of me to be here for you. I also want to give a shout out to Michael Blaylock of 16th and Broadway Productions here in Los Angeles, California, who's helping me keep things alive. Tammy, Terrell from R&B Slow Jams line. I'm on Instagram every Saturday on my Instagram with Tyrone DuBose on all social media platforms, where I do what's called a moment in music history that's now been seen over 2 million times collectively. So it means an awful lot to me of being able to live this life this way, and I'm forever grateful.
Catch them there, and you can catch this podcast wherever you stream and on the official YouTube channel at youtube.com/Beyond the Album Cover. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big thank you to the one and only America's premier R&B historian, Mr. Tyrone DuBose. Mr. DuBose, thank you for coming on Beyond the Album Cover, and you're welcome back anytime.
My absolute thanks to you too. Love and blessings, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for allowing me to be in your space. Thank you, sir.
No, thank you.